Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Before we get started, could you reach down and silence your phones because we are filming for MCAT. And it's being live streamed tonight, which means you can go to our Facebook page tomorrow or MCAT's Facebook page tomorrow and watch it again and share it with whoever you like. If someone says they would have liked to have seen it, please do share it. But we don't want any phones going off in the back, so if you can take a minute to do that. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Lisa Simon, co-owner of Radius Gallery with my husband, Jason, and we've had Radius as a contemporary art gallery for 11 years now. We are dedicated to amplifying local artists in our area. And we're helped by that with a really exceptional team of gallerists. You probably met Jonathan when you came in, and if you RSVP'd, you got an email from Elena, and maybe you met Megan as you came in too, who's been our gallery manager for 6 years. So it's a really exceptional team. We couldn't pull together events like this without them. We have an all ceramics gallery right next door, and if you haven't seen that show yet, it is coming down on Saturday. Some really gorgeous work of Deborah Schwarzkopf. And we're getting ready to set up a show of our 11th annual Ceramics Invitational. And our ceramic, so once a year we try to take a slice of what is going on in the field of ceramics. And Montana, this is our homage to the rich history of ceramics in Montana because of the Archie Bray over in Helena. And so it's really innovative. This year there's furniture in it and really innovative pottery. And you would think after thousands and thousands of years of pottery, how could it be innovative? But it is. You'll just have to come and see the fun things that they're doing with it. And wild sculptures, it's just a real joy. So that opening is next Friday from 5 to 7. And we welcome you to that. This is a second talk in a three-part series that takes up Salish history from a tribal lens. And this is a really wonderful way to learn history visually through art. And we have an exceptional guide in Aspen Decker. This history was probably not in the school books that you received when you went to school. So it is wonderful to have someone as knowledgeable and as deeply invested in this history as Aspen. She has a degree in tribal historic preservation from the Salish Coupney College and a master's in linguistics. And she's very into the study of languages and put a lot of work into the Salish language. And one of her innovations in ledger art is that she always includes little pieces of the Salish language. And so as you're engaging with the art, you're engaging with this language that was almost lost. So she's absolutely qualified to tell us about the history of the Salish people whose lands Missoula occupies. And tonight we're going to hear about the first contact of Indigenous people with non-Indigenous people up to the Hellgate Treaty of 1855, which was 170 years ago. So think about where your people were 170 years ago and when that little piece of history was unfolding that still impacts who we are and what we're doing here now. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Aspen Decker.
Lam shul paul ia buko suno list komkomels to list kadli smimi. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming here to listen to me talk about some stories about my people, my skadli. As Lisa said, I'm gonna kind of continue on this narrative of history. My last talk was more about time immemorial, so what was our traditional way of life before any contact. And so now I'm going to talk about the first fur trader and Lewis and Clark, and this one is also about the treaties. So I guess first I'll talk a little bit about ledger art. Can I see a show of hands, like how many people were at my last talk? Oh yeah, quite a few. Rest. Oh no, so I'll just briefly talk about what ledger art is, because I feel like once you understand like the reason behind not having the facial features and the significance of it is important to really be able to understand the storytelling and narrative of ledger art. And so the reason there are no faces that you typically see in European portraiture is because for indigenous peoples, a lot of tribes, our identity is related to what our tribal designs are, who our family designs are. So the faces weren't really as important. And especially considering how we're so connected to our ancestors, emotion, and to who we are today and our entire life cycle. Our faces change over time. And but we're still the same person. So it's how do you capture that identity of who you are? And so it's through that regalia. And a lot of times you'll notice just different beadwork and sort of this likeness of Salish Kasanka people. So I draw from what are our colors, the colors that we typically use in our regalia, the shawls, the way that we wear certain beadwork and cuffs. And so a lot of times I start off with like a small piece and I grow the entire look of that person in the artwork. And so whether it's geometric or more of the plains floral, Salish floral, that's how I decide on my designs. And so the very early on artwork that I did was when I was a kid, and it was because I danced fancy at powwows. And so that was my like early on first experience with like doing art was typically like sewing and beading. And my mom taught me those things, my yaya, my grandma, and family. And so that really reflects on the way that I create artwork today. So all of this ledger art that I create, it's deeply rooted in my identity, in our language, in our culture, in our designs. And so today, talking about our perspective, a lot of times, like Lisa said, it's not really included in a lot of history books because I feel like a lot of our indigenous perspectives were overlooked or just not included and not really used as a credible source. And through that colonization, some of these narratives start to influence what we think we know because it's through Jesuits and kind of Christianity that has kind of altered our culture. There's that cultural adaptation. But now, going back, teach you a couple signs too. This is the sign for a long time ago. Everybody do that? And depending on how far back it was, you say eep. So we have this kind of intonation. I like to use this when I teach in schools where I have the kids like walk around the entire room or like gym, wherever we're at. And it's like whoever could do the longest eep of like how far back in history can you go? And so some of them I'm like, you made it all the way back to like dinosaur time, for how long you could keep the eep. But this sign, and then if you made this sign right here, this is our elders. But when you're including those two signs, you're saying our ancestors, long time ago people. Emotion is how we say ancestors. And the word that we use for ourselves is indigenous, and the other signs that we have is Bitterroot Sedlish, the Ta'a'ayaken, Bitterroot Sedlish. And so that sign right here I had this misconception of thinking that we were saying we're flat head when we're actually saying we're the hair that stands on top. Because a lot of times this little like upper part of your hair right here, it was like kind of brushed into like a poof and add a smaller braid into the other two braids. And so it was kind of like an identification marker too of like, oh, that's a Bitterroot Sedlish man. And so we knew our different tribal allies, whether they were Nez Perce, Shoshone, Spokane, other sister Salish tribes, because we went over to get the buffalo every year. So we had these different allied tribes that we had a very close relationship with. And some of them actually stayed in the Bitterroot Valley with us during the winter months too, sometimes when they were already gonna come with us to get the buffalo, the kway kway. And so there was a lot of this intertribal like society where we had our cultural norms. And so that's kind of where I want to shift into. Like this one is like a really brief one that I'm going to mention because there wasn't a whole lot of white interaction before Lewis and Clark, but some of our Skedli, some of our Salish already witnessed our first white person before they came through. And so a lot of it was through more of like in the south, through our Shoshone trade. Some of them witnessed seeing a Suiapi person. So it was through the Hudson Bay and different trading companies that was kind of bringing a lot of non-natives into this, this western area. And so this piece right here, it has all these different animals that were harvested by a lot of the first fur traders. And so I wanted to include the buffalo and these beavers and all these different things because it's a huge part of the history here is not only the Salish and Kasanka and indigenous peoples, but it affected the land here too. So when we went through colonization and all this new influence on the ecosystem, it affected everything. And a part of our value system is that we're caring for the land, for the animals, for everything around us, because it all has a purpose. It's all a part of our seasonal cycles, our seasonal round. And so we need to also protect those animals. And so when we had some of the sort of historical trauma, these things, it also happened to the landscape because there's all this development, all this change that eradicated a lot of different animals, or at least brought them down to near extinction, like the buffalo. And so having these animals on here in sort of this pictographic way in a circle is representing that seasonal cycle of those animals. Because we had certain times that we went to harvest the hlpa, all these different animals like the winter weasel, the beavers. We had times of doing that to also respect the beauty of nature and having babies. So when animals were having babies, we left them alone. And we had different indicators like flowers that told us the elk are having their babies right now. So the mtchewe, those yellow balsam root, that was the indicator that the elk are having babies. And so it was a time to leave them alone. And when we knew that, they're trying to get their lives kind of, back into like a good way of getting, all their food again, getting their hides and everything, nurtured back to being healthy. Because there's a time, I don't know if you've noticed, like a lot of deer, they kind of look rugged, like right after winter. And so they're having a tough time, and that's the time of kind of leaving them alone and knowing that you need to wait those months to let those babies grow up enough that, we're not depleting resources and we're respecting those animals. Now, and so you'll notice too, there's all these teepees on this one and this one. And so you'll see this a lot in ledger art, especially in like the 1800s. And so the circular teepee design, it reflects the encampment of that like tribe. And so I feel like using this design is such a perfect way of capturing our identity as Kedli, our encampment, because like I was saying, those seasonal rounds, the seasonal cycles, it's all rather like circular. And so it's a part of that life cycle and following those seasons, and everything about our culture is around like having, consideration for everything around us. And for a lot of us, it feels like it's circular and it's not really squared like we're, in these buildings. That's why our teepees and a lot of our symbols, like our medicine wheel, that's like our seasonal cycle, it's circular. And so this encampment on both of these are representing the people. So without having to do a lot of like what we see in more Western art about Native peoples, kind of that earlier work where it's like a camp where they're drying meat and, you know, it just shows everybody. I felt like I don't really need to show everybody in the camp because this symbol is the representation of everybody. So even though it doesn't look like the Skedli, if the people are on this piece right here, they are represented in the teepee. And the teepees have our seasonal colors. So these four different colors, they represent the seasons, the spring, winter, summer, fall, and also directional of south, you know, the south, north, south, east, and west. And so it's all about our life cycles. It captures our culture in the seasonal round. And so when thinking about Lewis and Clark coming here, we hear a lot of narratives about them because they were the first ones here. So I feel like a lot of times they're held up as these kind of like heroes, you know, or these gods, when how do we really know how they were? You know, like, were they actually good people? Are we holding up good people that came through here just because they were the first ones? And so, without getting too political about, you know, Lewis and Clark, I just want you to reflect on our perspective and the narrative of kind of what happened through our lens. Because a lot of times we hear a one-sided history without hearing the others. And so when they came here, there was a lot of, I think, miscommunication too, because they didn't understand our language. And we speak with our Stekilsecht, with our sign language. So Sacagawea understood Stekilsecht because she's Shoshone, who is also a friend tribe or ally tribe to the Salish. But as they came through here, you know, a lot of times we hear that the Salish were just gifting them all these things and welcome them in, but you're not really thinking about, like, you know, everything that goes into protecting the people, especially during that time where our political system was really complex. A lot of times it's looked at as being romanticized, of just out here fishing and doing all these things, but there was a lot going on between intertribal, you know, societies where we had trading and different social norms, our values that helped keep us in a good way with each other and helping one another. But as they came here, this piece, you could notice that there's Salish on horseback, and they have their bows and arrows. And, you know, they're ready for battle too, because we're standoffish. It wasn't like we're just, oh yeah, come over here, you're our friends now. No, we had scouts that were always watching out for the people, making sure that our enemy tribes weren't coming in. And so at that time, Chesh, Three Eagle, he was the chief, one of the chiefs, and he saw them coming. And so he was one of those scouts that knew that they were coming, and he saw them as being pitiful because they had these kind of ugly horses, and you know, they looked just rough and cold. And you know, that was a lot of their first times even, you know, seeing you know, white people, and also York was with them. But he watched them, and he was making sure that, you know, are they going to attack? Does it look like they're trying to have war with us? And so we had around 80 warriors in our Specum, in that place, that area in the Bitterroot Valley, who were ready to fight and wipe them out if we needed to. But it was a matter of observing them, seeing their intent. And so at that time, you know, like, we didn't really know what their intent was. They seemed to come to be like, you know, we're here, we're not here to fight. And who knows with the translations of like what was really narrated to them. And they probably weren't able to explain, you know, their entire expedition or the actual purpose that they were doing, you know, why they were doing this expedition. And also to think that it wasn't just about seeing the land over here, documenting the waterways. It was a way of assimilating the natives and knowing what they were doing, the indigenous peoples here, and how could they kind of steal more land. And so thinking about that, it wasn't just some trip where you're just trying to get to the ocean. There was a lot more that went into that, and the things that followed that really affected indigenous communities. And getting back to just this piece, one thing that I really want to stress is the language part of things. Bitterroot, Specum. That's one thing that got named after Luisia reviva. Lewis was named after the bitterroot, but that was a form of colonization. And that wasn't our way, our perspective or worldview about that plant. And so from this foreign palate and trying this, thinking it's some gross root that's bitter, he named it that. And then it made everyone have this perspective that this is a gross, bitter root. And so him naming it that, it took the power of what that root means to us. That root is powerful. It's a staple food for Salish. And it goes beyond just being this food. It's the representation of the people as well. So those roots, they go into the ground, they spread out, but they're connected at the heart. So I don't know if you know, but like the bitterroot actually has a little red heart, right where it's where a typical heart would be on a body. It's just like right in there. And we leave that in the ground. So we have this protocol to when we're harvesting bitterroot. But a lot of our elders say that the heart of the bitterroot is the heart of the Salish. And so there's so much that goes into that bitterroot, and we love it. Every year, every season, we still have our harvesting practices with the bitterroot. And the way we see it isn't as a gross bitterroot. We see it as this beautiful specum. Specum. And that's the word that he should have wrote down. Specum, or nakamtu, the Coupney word, or some of our other indigenous languages, we have our terms for the specum and different plants. And our perspective is that it's good for you. And we have an entire oral story of how it came to be and how it saved the people from starvation. And I can't really tell the stories right now because it's springtime now. It's supposed to be told in the winter months. But that specum, there's so much meaning in it, and there's so much that just connects us to our ancestors. And it's a good food, and with our sluck and the way that we prepare it, sweetens those specum up. And so he didn't even give it a chance to say, oh, you know what, let me try it in this way. And when they sat down too, they didn't even take some of the dry meat and some of the food that we were trying to help them because they were starving at that time and, not well off. But I don't know if they thought it was bark or something that we're giving them, the dry meat, but they chose not to eat it for the most part. I think it's either Lewis or Clark. Clark was the one that did all the journaling. He said that he got sick from the camas, and it made him have the runs. So it kind of cracks me up to think that, he didn't really have the indigenous palate or foods, in his DNA. So he got sick from it, but I've never had that ever happen. And I know that our community, that's one of our staple foods, and we could eat as much as we pretty much want, and it's good for us. So it's just the way that you're viewing those things. And also with the Latin word being called Luisia reviva, because they took some of that bitterroot when it was dry and it came back to life and continued to grow even though it was dried up. So that just shows how powerful that root is. But it's wrong that they named the bitter root in both the Latin, they used his term for the description, and they also gave him the Latin word as like, this is the hero, instead of saying this is the bitter root Salish people or something referring to us, because we made it so they survived that expedition. Now, Specum. What was I gonna say about this piece? Oh, and the horses too. That's like one thing that I love about kind of what our culture committees also talked about, is just how beautiful our horses were at that time. He traded 7 really sickly horses that were, barely making it, and we gave him a dozen beautiful horses. Like he said, they were stunning horses or something like that in his journal, that these were beautiful horses. And the one thing that I think he didn't understand was our value system in trading. And so it's documented that, our Skedli brought out some robes for them to sit on, and they didn't know that they're supposed to sit on them, and instead they threw them on their shoulders. And then bringing out that food, they chose not to eat it. And then the same thing for the trade is, we were used to these social norms of trading with different allied tribes. And it's just a part of being a good person, a part of your value system is to know that when you trade with somebody, you trade in a good way. It has to be like equitable. It's a good trade. So you have to give the same amount that you're receiving. And so that's a part of our Salish reciprocity. And I'm giving you something and you're gonna give it back. And so we're really big on that. Like when somebody comes to your home, you provide them with food, and if they wanted to sleep there, you give them the best blankets, you let them sleep there, and then, trading to help one another. But it's this kind of worldview that you're gonna receive everything that you give. And at that time, I don't think they knew the intentions of Lewis and Clark, and that they weren't really there to help the people. They weren't really here to be allies. They were just taking. And so what they traded with us wasn't equitable at all. It was, these sickly horses that weren't making it. They had the dozen horses from us, plus all of these saddle packs, which are from our kwai, our buffalo hunts, and the amount of work that goes into the seasonal round to have to harvest those buffalo, go over the Continental Divide, to have to scrape the hide and to form it into whatever it is, our belongings, adding beadwork and regalia to it. It's a long process. That might have taken 6 months to a year for them to sit there and quill up and create, harvest, and for them to just give that to them, plus the horses, and then later on an additional 7 beautiful horses that they end up eating later on, because they weren't prepared. So I'm not trying to just dog on Lewis and Clark, but it's important to really realize sort of what was happening in that time. We really romanticized them of being these amazing humans, and a lot of times even the indigenous women of that time are seen as being promiscuous or something, in some of the journals, when in fact we never even had other relationships. You had your one Chelui, your husband, and that was the person that you were with. And a lot of our tribes had different protocols and shunning if certain things that were inappropriate happened between each other, where you could be shunned from the people. And so it's just that narrative that I don't want to see continue on, that, oh, these women were this way. It wasn't that way. And, I don't really want to use the terms here of like what they did to our women, but it just wasn't good. And, it's just a part of history. It is what happened. And even though a lot of this history is hard to hear, it's difficult, it's important that we acknowledge these things, these atrocities, and know how to move forward. How do we continue on, and how do we mutually live and reside on this land respectfully? And a lot of our core values is to have that respect for the land, keep the land clean, have that reciprocity and relationship. I know that a lot of us feel that the same way. We don't just want to go leave our trash around in the mountains. We don't want to see these harmful impacts on our environment. So I know that together, we could do things that are going to help our environment and our land that we're living on together now. And I think that's the way that we move forward, is to acknowledge what happened, acknowledge the boarding schools and all of these things. And throughout all of this history, all this hard history of things that happened through removals, our people remained to be resilient and beautiful and have all of these amazing stories, and the ways that we keep them going and sharing them with our children. Our language and everything is oral tradition, so it was passed on through the different generations. And it's important that we know what's happened to this land that we're living on now. And our Salish and Kasanka history dates back over 15,000 years ago, from the last ice age. So there's so much that has happened in that time that we need to understand, because the land is still feeling it today, because the time that we're on this land is really brief. And so what we're leaving, we shouldn't be leaving anything that's gonna impact the land and the environment. Now, I guess in moving on, after Lewis and Clark came through, there's actually been like a few different instances where like Shining Shirt, he saw the first white people coming through a vision. And that's also an important part to mention in history, because through Christianity, they manipulated his vision and what he saw coming. He just said, there's white people, pale face with the long black robes, who are coming to this land. That was his vision. And so they twisted it and said he sought after the Jesuits. He wanted a greater power because, our ways wasn't good enough. There's this all this history that goes behind that first interaction of the vision. And also, even before any Suiapi, actual white contact, we already were witnessing and experiencing the effects of colonialism. So we had horses that were introduced in the early 1900s, late 1600 and 1700. And that's where we had our first influence of having the horses, which was a good thing because we were able to move throughout even further distances with ease. And it also was a time where disease started to be introduced, so new diseases, and that really impacted our people. And this one right here is describing, or it's about the the Helena Salish that lived there. And there was actually 5 or 6 Salish bands here in Montana, and now we only have 2 left, the Bitterroot Salish and the Upper Kalispel. But the Chitmutsheh Salish, they almost got completely wiped out by smallpox. And same with some of those other Salish tribes. So the ones that survived or were strong enough, they merged with the other Salish and Coupney and Upper Kalispel. And so it's important to understand the onset of oppression or colonization. Was we had these horses, which were a good thing. We had these diseases brought in. And then the first contact was kind of seeing some of the first Suiapis here. And then guns too. So warfare, or not warfare, firearms. Like they were something that came later on after horses and before Lewis and Clark came. So by the time he was here, we actually had a lot of trade by then. And a lot of that was through Shoshone. So different tribes, we were able to get things from like the East Coast or wherever, because different tribes had their big region. They traded, and then they traded with them all the way across. And the Shoshone, they had a really big landscape that they occupied that was kind of the connecting from up here down to the southwest. And so when they had horses, they were the ones that first gave them to the Salish. And then from there, we built these big herds, and the horses became a huge part of our indigenous cultures. We now have ceremonies and, regalia, and they're really held up as in high regards in our culture now. And it's a big part of our Skedli way of being, is having these and I actually grew up with a buckskin horse that was mine, and I always rode horses in the mountains, and I do love these animals, so that's why you see a lot of horses in my artwork, and a lot of them end up having like a buckskin horse, at least somewhere, and my horse had like the black socks too on his legs, so I usually kind of make it similar to what my horse was. Now, I guess now kind of shifting into the treaty. This piece right here is representing the upper and lower Kalispel. And so our Kadlispe, we have the Bitterut Sedlish at Ayakan, and then the Kadlispe, who were kind of more by the Flathead Lake and that whole area. So we just kind of came together seasonally to hunt buffalo, harvest certain things. But then it was like our winter camps that we would go back to certain areas that made us sort of separate. But linguistically, we're considered one dialect. So there's the Kalispel, Salish, and Spokane are considered one language under the our dialect systems. So we have 23 different Salesian languages within our Salesian language family. And we're the furthest inward Salish, and then it goes all the way Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and then all the way up into British Columbia. So there's the kind of split of more coastal Salish and interior Salish. So our interior Salish is kind of different from coastal Salish, but when I was in linguistics, I could tell that we had all these similarities through the structure. So I see how we're categorized as one Salesian language family. And what's interesting is a lot of the plant names are the oldest words because they were here, they were native to this land. And so when I was a kid, when I first started learning language, I went to this conference and it was about the plants. And so everyone from all these different Salish tribes, we wrote down our words for the bitterroot, for the sluk and the stashat, the huckleberries, and all these different plants. And they seemed closest, the closest nouns, the closest words that we had to each other, no matter how far apart we were, was the plants. So that just shows how old, those words are. So going back to the bitterroot, the Specum, all these other Salish tribes, they have slight dialectal differences. But that word is so old that sometimes the words that I know and say, they're so old that they don't even really have the root of it. It's just it just is what it is. It is the Specum. Now, and this one has Swedlitwe. So you see these little bulbs down here? Swedlitwe. Swedlitwe. This is our sign for it. And so we ate those bulbs. It was also one of our staple foods. And so this piece is representing both the lower and upper Kalispe. And it wasn't until the Hellgate Treaty, or the treaty signing in the US, that it split our two Kalispel tribes. So the reason it's called Lower and Upper Kalispel is because of the river. So the lower Kalispe, they were kind of up into Usk and Washington area, and the upriver is our Kalispe here by Flathead Lake and this whole area. And so we came together seasonally. We often went back and forth in the river with our canoes. This is a blunt nose canoe. We have our sturgeon nose canoes and just different styles that actually differ from the ones that kind of go upwards, typical canoes that you see. A lot of ours go downwards, so it's kind of going into the water. We also have our cedar dugout canoes. But it's a good representation of Kalispe. And again, you'll see the colors of the yellow, the red, green, and blue that are representing that seasonal round, that seasonal travel. And then I added different colors for the tepees on each side because it's representing two encampments. And then these red dots are kind of representing the split of that treaty. So after our treaty, they were trying to get the Kalispel from Washington to move on to our reservation, but they refused it. They said, no, we're not going to leave this place either. And so after the treaties were kind of over of like establishing them with tribes, they were left without a reservation or any kind of recognition. And so it wasn't until later that the Coupney, the lower Coupney have their reservation now. But you know, it was important that like we didn't just stop seeing each other. We didn't just stop, you know, commuting back and forth in the river. I have actually aunts and uncle that like live over in Usk because they're still a part of our people. We're still Inkwit, we're still one people. And so this is what this one kind of represents, is just that Hellgate Treaty and their treaty in Washington, the Coupney people split. And yeah, that's just kind of a big spill on like some of that early contact. There's so much that I could talk about with like different stories too. But I do also want to save some of the ones that are like kind of going onto the reservation for my next talk. So I'll talk more about like the ones that have policies and the removal of our I guess I'll open it up to questions because give it a break. No? So
So we used to live up by Troy and Libby, Coupney Falls. What happened to the Coupney Native Americans up there when the whites came in? Because they didn't establish a reservation up there, did they?
There was like a split too between the Kasanka and Kootenai. So they say Kootenai for the Canada Kootenai, and then there's the Kasanka, which is the Kootenai on our reservation, and I'm also Kasanka, but it was like right after the treaties were established that some of them had to get pushed and stay on our reservation, and then some of them went up into Canada, and then the other Kasanka, Kootenai, went to Bonners Ferry. So there was like these splits, and the Kootenai actually in Bonners Ferry they have a really interesting story because they end up what do you call it? Like they declared war against the United States government, and they were the first and only tribe, I think, and even people who ever done that. And so they did that because they didn't end up getting a reservation established, and their housing, they were like falling apart. They were just living in nothing and complete poverty. So they wanted to have those same rights and to be acknowledged as a federally recognized tribe. And so they did this, and some of the elders who actually taught me language and who are still alive today, they were a part of that kind of revolt, and it was during the time of Ames, like the American Indian movement. So like Russell Means, you know, and all those Skadli, they came up from like North Dakota. They stopped here on our res, and we gave them some of our license plates, like our 15 license plates. And then they were able to get into the Kootenai res over there, like where they were at, because they were trying to keep all the Ames out. And so they were only allowing, you know, people from like Montana, Washington in there. And there's like video of, yeah, one of my teachers from over in Kalispe, over at the lower Kalispell, and he's just like singing, and they're having a powwow, smiling all huge, and then like there's all these like, you know, guns and cavalry just like waiting there thinking it's like an actual war or something, but we're just like sitting there having a good time. So it did force them to give, or not force them, but it helped so that it became federally recognized tribe. So there's just all these like really interesting stories, and sometimes those stories come out of that resiliency. So some of them it's just kind of like, man, that just is because you were put in that position of having to survive. And so we see a lot of these warriors who have these crazy stories of like what they had to do for the people. But they're pretty good stories. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
I really enjoy the visual representation of the history, and your stories really bring it to life. Have you considered, or are you thinking about maybe the possibility of putting this all into a book?
Yeah, actually that's my next step, is I want to do a book where it has like the image and then the history. So hopefully within this next few months, I want to try to get it done before the Santa Fe Indian Market, because I'll be going down there. So yeah, in the next few months, just kind of keep an eye out for this book, and it's going to have the history, all these histories through our perspective.
I wonder
wondered if you would talk about your process as a painter and what do you struggle with as you try to depict things and what feeds you?
Yeah, I think what really helps is that this has been a lifetime of my work. And so I started learning language and culture growing up, like that was a part of my upbringing. And then, like I said earlier, my focus has been about language revitalization. So ever since I was like 10, I started trying to really get fluent in the language. And then I was 13 when I apprenticed under an elder, Pat Pierre, and got all that experience with different elders. And that's where I got fluent, and then decided my entire life's work needs to be about the language and bringing it back, speaking to my kids. So that's where I became a teacher, and I've taught like 10 years on and off with like preschool all the way up to college level age of teaching the language and culture. And then the bachelor's in tribal historic preservation was getting into kind of that cultural landscape, understanding the anthropology and archaeology of our belongings. And I think that really helped to kind of give that the facts, of science that backs our oral tradition and our way of being, because through dendrochronology and all these different things that where you could really test the trees and different areas and sites that show what we were doing there and what kinds of harvesting we were doing with the bark baskets. There's just a lot of interesting things that I found through my my bachelor's, and that part of my career was like going from having just that immersion and cultural upbringing and not really questioning anything. It was like, this is just the way that it is. The elders told me these stories. This is the language, and it is what it is. But I felt like when I got into my bachelor's, that's where I started thinking through like, well, how do we show that this is facts for us? It's not some folklore, stories that a lot of people say. These for us are what they are. They are real, they are factual, and now scientific evidence helps to back those things up, and indigenous knowledge, because everything that we did in our seasonal round, we were doing trial and error. There was a lot of that scientific, data collecting and understanding astronomy and documenting it for thousands of years to understand what we know about the seasons and about the constellations and all these different things. So I felt like that was a really cool introduction of being able to really question things, also like Christianity and the influences in our culture. And so that's something that I think about a lot too, is just like questioning, is this from more of a Christian influence, or is this traditional Salish knowledge? And so those are things that I think a lot about, and also what is culturally sensitive. I grew up in, elders saying, don't share these ceremonies or things like, things that shouldn't be shared to the public. So I already got that upbringing of you can't be sharing certain things. So I feel like through that, it helps to not share anything that's culturally sensitive. And so I think about what's culturally appropriate. What do I want to share, and what do I want people to know about our people without sharing too much? Because certain things are meant for the people. Even though I'm sharing, all these things about plants or history, it doesn't mean I want people to go out and start harvesting, just because, some things are meant for the people, but it's good to acknowledge those things and respect them. And then leading into my master's in linguistics, that was just understanding the breakdowns of the language, like the roots and what it actually means. So there's like a rule to everything. And so for me, I feel like I really want to keep the authenticity of the language and making sure that it's accurate to how our elders and our emotion, our ancestors talked. So there's a lot that's going on in my thought process of like, what do I want to preserve and what do I want to revitalize and keep going? And the narratives that we're saying to our children, I feel like they should be healthy. They should be, that direct traditional knowledge to them. And so a lot of my concepts, I end up I just have this like notes on my phone, and so I start adding all of these different ideas of like, oh, I remember this elder saying this, and then to go along with that, there's like a whole series that could come out of certain topics. And so I feel like it's definitely going to keep me busy for a really long time. And then I also think through like, how is this going to transfer to these maps, because they're all real antique original maps from 1800s. So I don't really just go in and start drawing all crazy. I really think through where's the placement and making sure that certain information like the Salish or Flathead Lake, it used to be called Salish Lake instead of just Flathead Lake, Salish Lake. So I try to leave certain things open where you're not covering, really important information that's kind of a part of the narrative of where we're at. Sometimes I'll use it as like a trail marker of showing like the Bitterroot removal. But yeah, there's a lot that goes into thinking about the integrity of even designs, thinking about encampment and this pictographic style that is still here today because our ancestors, us today, the future, for our skedli, it's a part of our value that it's all connected, that it's all important. And so I want to keep that information, the technique, these kind of like older symbols going, as well as being creative and having kind of my own concepts of these things. So yeah, it's a lot that goes into it, but that was a good question. Oui?
How did your people respond to Sacagawea? Are there stories that came down? Maybe she was married to one of the white men. And how did your people respond to her?
I think that she was a big part of the reason they probably didn't just wipe him out. And I think that's the whole reason, they brought this native girl who knew sign language, because they knew that plain sign language, it stretched way over into all these tribes. And so she was kind of that icon of, oh, we might like wait and see what's going on here, because they have this little girl with them and these little babies, and just her, I'm sure, dressed in like Shoshone regalia, you'd be able to identify that that's an allied tribe and then be able to communicate with her. No. Yeah.
How are the language revitalization efforts going for your people?
I feel like good, just because my 4 children, they only speak Salish to me, and I only speak Salish to them. So they're the first language Salish speakers in our community in over 70 years. Yeah, so I feel like as a linguist and as a language revitalization activist, all these things, like I feel like that's the ultimate goal, has always been to have children speakers. So I think just having them gives us hope that our language is going to continue on for the next couple generations at least. And I know that I'm going to only talk Salish to my grandkids, and it's just that legacy of like continuing on. We also have different language curriculums too, so that also gives me hope that we have new language learners who are trying their best to learn the language.
Where could we study with you?
But now I'm actually going to be coming out with an online resource, hopefully in this next year, whenever I get time, aside from all this art. But I do want to do a plain sign language online resource, and then like a basic Salish one where you could hear about me talking about the linguistic variation of Salishyan languages. So that really will just help you to understand our language. And I know a lot of people also mentioned they want to know how to read the language. So that'll be a part of that like basic curriculum. Especially when you're traveling through our reservation, you could see all those signs. So that's, I think, a big goal for people, is to be able to read them as they go through.
And to know how to say it.
Yeah, properly.
It's complicated a little bit.
For sure, and it's Salish going up and then Coupney coming back. So a lot of people don't know that, yeah, it's 2 different languages on each side of the town.
Is that the way the signs are now?
Yep, so Salish when you're heading towards Kalispell, and then Coupney on your way back through. No. Anyway?
I wanted to follow up on your question. In older times, did your people use the sign language simultaneously with the words, and are you doing the same with your children? So as you're speaking to them, you're using the sign language so that it's a dual language, really?
Mm-hmm. Yep, our sign language, our Stukul, it wasn't about being a non-hearing community. It was just spoken alongside our actual language, and it's called a pidgin language because it's not like, it doesn't have like the is and the the and kind of like, all those connecting words, but it gives you all of the main details of the subject what they're doing. And so we were always using sign language as we talked, and that's also something that is, getting more scarce on our res. And I definitely try to incorporate as much sign language as I can to my children, and so it really helps that we could, talk from afar too, of like, come do this or that, and yeah, and that's actually how I picked up on language so fast. Was my main teacher, Pat Pierre, he always used signs. So anything I didn't understand, he was like filling it in with like the subject and what they were doing, and then all these synonyms, and then I was able to understand it without us switching into English. Because after like 3 months of going and apprenticing under him, he just stopped talking English to me. So we stayed in the language, and he also said, you should keep me going in the language, and if I ever talk in English, tell me, correct me, and say talk Sedlish. And so that was just a big part of that upbringing, is staying in the language and then also using signs to understand and to also keep that going. That's a big part of that second language that goes along with our language.
Following that, then sign language is how you communicated with all the allies centuries ago. They could all use the same sign language, so they didn't need to know the dialect.
Yep, that was the way that we communicated. So this is like the sign for sign language to Kulsech, it was through trade that we use signs and are able to communicate with each other.
Okay?
What tribes were your enemies and why?
Those Quayshin, the Blackfeet, were actually our Sedlish and a majority of the local tribes' enemies here. And so that's actually what this piece kind of represents here. This series is about that allyship, because we wanted more numbers when we would go to get the buffalo, to get the Kwai. So this is a representation of the Sinjomene, which you'll see written, which means the Spokane tribe, Sinjomene, and Eska, the trail to the buffalo. And so we had the Spokane tribe, the Nez Perce, sometimes the Shoshone, and then Coeur d'Alene, and like a few different Sedlish tribes that would come meet us in the Coupney. And so we would all go together to the plains, and that was just to have all of these people there, so maybe they wouldn't attack us, and we were just safer in those numbers. And they were just our enemy tribe, because yeah, it was just kind of the same as today. Like sometimes we have those enemies. It was a part of that society at that time. But what was interesting is it was a really complex society, so it wasn't just us going crazy all the time trying to hunt each other down, but instead we had times of the year that we met up here in Missoula or other places for marriage exchange. So your Nachwan, your Sahelui, it was a big part of the life ways that you had to continue on and have that relationship, and also respect. And so that's where you didn't just go in and kill each other all the time. We had different ways of settling conflict, like the stick game, where you could play the game, and it was a game, and as soon as you were done, whoever won was like the winning tribe of that battle. And then we also had counting coup, which is where you have like a stick or a coup stick or something, and then you just like tap their shoulder. And so it's like, I could have killed you, but I chose not to. So it's that way of respecting life. And then we had our times where we definitely battled it out. And so that's why we had all these ally tribes. But it was complicated. We had our times of coming together, our times of going to get buffalo and fighting. But a lot of our families are intermixed. Actually, my great-grandfather is Blackfeet, so I also have Blackfeet blood. No.
Related to the ledger art particularly, how old were you when you first decided you wanted to do ledger art, and did you have a mentor?
Yeah, my husband was actually the first one to introduce me to ledger art. And so early on, when I was apprenticing under that Pat Pierre, he had us doing art journals, so sketching a lot. And anytime we would go to the mountains or to these like kind of cultural field trips, he had us sketch it and then dash and write the Salish words for everything in that image. So that was like the very first onset of adding Salish language to my artwork, and that was when I was like 13. So that was like kind of that influence. And then kind of early on was more just drawing and acrylic painting and stuff in my like teens, early adulthood. And then my husband, he introduced me to ledger art, and he actually has a art history bachelor's, and so he had like this whole spill. He taught at Salish Coupney College about the ledger art and like what it represents. And inadvertently, I was already doing it through my regalia. Like, it's never gone away. It's always been a big part of our people's designs. We have all these ledger buffalo, ledger horses, and imagery that means this is identifying our Indian name or who we are. So it's always been a part of our beadwork and regalia. But the ledger art itself started around like after I met my husband, and he introduced me to, oh, you should work with some of these like old ledger papers. And then I started working with a ledger book that I purchased from 1874. And then from there, I decided to start working with maps. And I really like these old maps because sometimes I use the year to correlate the history. So the Dawes Act of 1887, I found a map of 1887. Oh, where's the Dawes Act? Up here, 1887. So there's like the Dawes Act representation. And during that time, these maps, they were showing stolen land from Native peoples. It was a time of removal. And now through this artwork, I feel like it's a way of bringing our stories back and having a new narrative for the place and the way that we see it.
What is considered ledger art paper? I think Raphael was talking to us at one point about it doesn't have to be ledger paper, that it's a whole genre of, I don't know if that's the right word for it, of paper, and it could be maybe even just found paper in early years. Can you speak?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because there's like, where's the border of things? Because I also just posted one recently, and one of my friends on there, he was just like, why do you have to use old ledgers when people of that time, they were using the paper of their time to tell their stories? And I said, that's true. Like, I could be using ledger paper from today, but I just choose to use these old papers to like share that history of that time. And I feel like even like the names and the streams, all that like correlates to what was going on in a time that we really need to preserve. But as far as like the paper, yeah, I definitely think it's just a style, because like I was saying earlier, that beadwork, we had all these stylized imagery. We always had these kind of like no faces in our people that were like ledgery, like riding horses in our regalia. I actually had a shawl when I was a kid that had a bunch of ledger horses that were similar to like this piece up here. It was like a bunch of colorful ledger horses running through it. And so it's just a part of that. Yeah, it's kind of both though. Like, you'll see different ledger artists who use sort of this pictographic style horses. And then sometimes, do I even have any horses that are spread out? Kind of this one, but you'll notice in some of my other work where the horse has like really sharp legs. And so you'll notice that there's like these different types, kind of like, so sometimes when we work with schools, we'll have kids like kind of draw these different styles. So some of them, like John Pepion, he has some work here. He's a really great ledger artist, but he uses like really big hooves at the end of his horses, and that's kind of his own personal style, and you see that sometimes too, or in 1800s ledger art. And then sometimes you see the sharp legs where it doesn't have a hoof. And then sometimes you'll notice more of this pictographic, simple horse like that, where it has like a really long neck. And so different artists just kind of have their different styles. And sometimes I switch between more pictographic and then more ledgery, and sometimes even more contemporary horses that, I just choose to have somewhat of realism of adding eyes versus just no eyes. So you'll kind of see a variation in my work.
Before we go, could you tell us a little bit about the third talk that you're going to do?
Yeah, so for the third talk, I'm going to get into the reservation period. So there's a few pieces that I have about like the Dawes Act and the removal of the Shotli, the Arli band. So yeah, it's just more of like as soon as we were removed, what's some of that history. So yeah, I hope to see you there, and Thank you all for coming.